Imagine this. You're flying home from Europe to the United States. In your suitcase, you have an ordinary chocolate gift for your nephew, a small egg wrapped in bright foil. Nothing suspicious, just a sweet that any European, Canadian, or Mexican child might eat for breakfast as casually as an American child eats an Oreo cookie. But at the border, a customs officer stops you, confiscates the chocolate almost as if it were contraband, and openly warns you that if you were carrying 10 of those eggs, the fine could reach $2,500 for a chocolate that costs a couple of dollars. Sounds like some ridiculous urban legend, right? And yet this happened tens of thousands of times over the past 80 years and still happens today. We're talking about Kinder Surprise, the small chocolate egg with a toy hidden inside, which became one of the most recognizable sweets on the planet while officially being classified as a prohibited import in the world's richest country, alongside, for a moment, certain categories of weapons in the border agency's database.
How did a completely innocent children's chocolate become the subject of border raids, official contraband lists, and fines comparable to the price of a used car? Who was the first person to think of hiding a toy inside food, and why? Why did a multinational corporation that could have earned hundreds of millions of dollars a year from the largest consumer market on the planet simply go without access to it for decades, choosing to lose that money rather than cross the line of American law? And here's what's even more interesting. The man who came up with the idea never gave a single public interview during his nearly 90-year life. He avoided cameras for decades and, according to family lore, feared that his own children might be kidnapped for ransom. Yet he died, leaving behind a fortune greater than the combined personal fortunes of the founders of Google. How did an invisible recluse from a small Italian town build an empire whose product is recognized by virtually every child on the planet? And why did one seemingly minor technical detail in the product's design keep that empire fighting against the wall of American legislation for 80 years? That's where we're going to start, with war-torn Italy, where there wasn't even enough cocoa to make proper chocolate.
To understand where Kinder came from, we need to go back to Italy in the late 1940s. The country was still lying in ruins after the war. Cocoa was a strategic scarcity, almost impossible to obtain, and when it was available, it came at an astronomical price. An ordinary chocolate bar was practically a luxury, far beyond the reach of an average family. In the small town of Alba, in Italy's northwestern Piedmont region, a local confectioner named Pietro Ferrero ran a modest shop and faced a deceptively simple but almost impossible problem. How do you make a sweet that ordinary people can actually afford when the key ingredient, cocoa, is simply unavailable in sufficient quantities and whatever little exists costs like a delicacy? Italy's economy was still devastated in the late 1940s. Food rationing had not yet disappeared everywhere, and for the average family, chocolate was still a special occasion luxury rather than something you could afford to eat every day.
Ferrero's answer is found literally under his feet. In the foothills of the Alps around Piedmont, enormous quantities of hazelnuts had been growing for centuries. Local farmers traditionally used them in baking, but no one had seriously attempted to turn them into a full substitute for expensive cocoa. Ferrero began experimenting. He mixed a small amount of cocoa with a much larger quantity of ground roasted hazelnuts, sugar, and vegetable oil. The resulting paste cost several times less than solid chocolate, yet had a rich, nutty flavor that many people found even more interesting than traditional cocoa. The product was called gianduja, after a local carnival character and symbol of the Piedmont region. This wasn't simply a clever recipe for a small family confectionery. It was a solution born directly from poverty and scarcity, one that would ultimately shape the fate of an entire corporation for the next 70-plus years. That same hazelnut paste would become the foundation of Nutella, and later the familiar chocolate shell surrounding the Kinder Surprise egg. But Pietro Ferrero himself is not the main character of this story. He died relatively young, and the business passed to his son, Michele Ferrero, who was barely in his 20s at the time. And it was Michele's name that would become attached to the story of how a modest confectionery shop in a provincial Italian town transformed into one of the largest privately held companies on the planet, with annual revenue that today is measured in tens of billions of euros. Michele Ferrero had worked in the family business alongside his father from a young age, and he possessed a rare quality of a true entrepreneur. He could look at things everyone else considered ordinary and see them from a completely different angle, finding a business opportunity where others saw nothing more than tradition. In the early 1970s, he noticed something that, from a commercial perspective, almost no one had paid much attention to before. In Italy, as in many Catholic countries across Europe, families traditionally gave children large hollow chocolate eggs at Easter, sometimes with a small gift or sweet hidden inside. It was a beautiful tradition, but it happened literally once a year, and once Easter was over, everyone simply forgot about those eggs until the following spring.
The idea that came to Ferrero was deceptively simple. What if you took the basic mechanics of an Easter surprise egg and separated it from the holiday? What if you made the egg small, inexpensive, and available year-round in any grocery store? What if a child could experience that little ritual of opening a surprise not once a year, but literally every week, as long as their parents were willing to buy another piece of chocolate? In 1974, a product appeared that would be called Kinder Überraschung, Kinder Surprise. The design was brilliantly simple and at the same time technically demanding. On the outside was a chocolate shell made from two types of chocolate. Inside was a small yellow plastic capsule containing a toy that children could assemble. What's important here is to understand the scale of the engineering challenge rather than just the marketing idea. Ferrero had to develop a production process that could reliably and consistently separate the inedible plastic container from the edible chocolate, not on a handful of prototypes in a laboratory, but across millions of units every day on an industrial production line. The capsule had to remain completely sealed so that the chocolate could never come into contact with the toy, and the toy could never end up inside the chocolate itself. Any manufacturing failure here wasn't a minor defect. It represented a potentially serious safety risk for a child. And it was precisely this seemingly simple technical detail in the product's design that several decades later would become the legal trigger for one of the strangest and longest-running trade bans in the history of the United States. But we'll come back to that later.
The product takes off almost immediately after its launch. Within just a few years, Kinder Surprise becomes more than just another chocolate bar on the shelf. It turns into a genuine cultural ritual for entire generations of children. First in Italy, then across Western Europe, and soon in South America, Asia, and Australia. The company begins producing billions of toy-filled capsules every year, while the tiny toys themselves, figurines, puzzles, and buildable vehicles, become a separate collecting phenomenon among adults around the world, complete with online communities, auctions for rare pieces, and specialized catalogs. But while Kinder Surprise is becoming a cultural phenomenon in Europe and much of the rest of the world, something almost exactly opposite is happening on the other side of the Atlantic. To truly understand why Kinder Surprise ended up being illegal specifically in the United States, we need to go back much further than the product itself to 1938. That was the year the United States passed the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, one of the foundational laws that still underpins the country's system of food and drug safety regulation. Among its many provisions was a deceptively simple rule that would determine the fate of a small Italian chocolate egg for decades to come. A food product cannot be sold if it contains a non-edible foreign object inside it, unless that object serves an exclusively functional purpose. The classic example used by lawyers is a wooden toothpick inserted into a cocktail olive. The toothpick may not be edible, but it serves a practical purpose, holding the olive in place. A toy hidden inside a chocolate egg, however, serves no such function. It exists purely for entertainment, and that tiny distinction would eventually put Kinder Surprise on the wrong side of American law.
The law was written with a completely understandable, justified, and genuinely noble purpose: to protect children, above all, from the risk of choking on small foreign objects accidentally hidden inside a food product. The logic behind the legislation was straightforward and entirely reasonable. Children eat quickly, often without looking, put large pieces into their mouths, and may fail to chew properly. In that situation, accidentally swallowing a foreign object could become a serious choking hazard if a manufacturer decided to hide something inside a food product. The law never mentioned Kinder by name, of course. In 1938, the product didn't even exist in concept. It would not appear for another 36 years. But when a chocolate egg containing a toy finally reached the international market in 1974, it fell almost perfectly within the wording of this much older legislation, practically as if the law had been written specifically for it.
And this is where the first genuinely absurd irony of the story appears. In a Kinder Surprise egg, the toy isn't physically sitting inside the chocolate at all. It is enclosed in a separate, sealed plastic capsule that is completely isolated from the edible portion. The child eats the chocolate first and only afterward opens the yellow capsule containing the toy, making it practically impossible to confuse one with the other. In other words, the actual risk of swallowing the toy together with a piece of chocolate is essentially eliminated by the product's design itself. But American law, as enforced by the Food and Drug Administration, interprets the wording of the statute extremely literally and strictly. If a non-edible object is physically present anywhere inside a food product, it doesn't matter how securely that object is separated from the food. The entire product is considered prohibited from sale.
Ferrero tried several times to challenge this interpretation of the law. The company entered negotiations with American regulators and proposed different engineering solutions for the packaging and separation of the toy from the chocolate, but for decades it kept running into the same wall. Officials stood by the wording of the 1938 law. As a result, from the product's introduction in the 1970s all the way to 2017, the classic Kinder Surprise egg remained officially prohibited for sale throughout the United States. And this wasn't merely a technicality on paper or some outdated regulation that nobody actually enforced. It was a real and actively enforced law with real and very tangible financial consequences for anyone who decided to ignore it.
Now comes the most interesting part: what this formal legal ban actually looked like in real life for ordinary people. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the agency that meets you at the airport after a long international flight, officially listed Kinder Surprise eggs among products prohibited or strictly restricted from being brought into the country. In some official travel guidance, the chocolate egg appeared alongside categories such as certain weapons, medications, and agricultural products requiring special authorization. It sounds almost absurd, a children's chocolate egg appearing on the same list as potentially dangerous goods. Every year, millions of American tourists returning home from vacations in Europe, Canada, or Mexico bring these eggs back in their luggage, some simply unaware that the ban exists, because who in their right mind would expect a chocolate egg to be illegal?
Others know about the rule, but consider it so absurd that they genuinely hope to get through customs unnoticed.
Border officials, meanwhile, periodically carried out highly visible seizures at ports of entry, and the agency's official website even had a dedicated page explaining the rule to travelers, warning that bringing Kinder Surprise eggs into the United States could result in a fine of up to $2,500 per egg. Per egg individually, not per shipment. Imagine an ordinary American family returning from a vacation in Italy with 10 of these chocolate eggs for gifts for their children, nieces, nephews, and neighbors, an entirely innocent purchase made at an ordinary supermarket somewhere in Rome. In theory, that same family could face a penalty approaching $25,000 at the border, roughly the price of a decent used car, simply for carrying 10 small chocolate eggs in their suitcase.
At the same time, the chocolate itself was technically perfectly legal to consume once it was already inside the United States. If someone somehow managed to bring it across the border, simply eating a Kinder Surprise egg was not a crime. The restriction applied specifically to importing the product and commercially selling it within the United States. This created a genuinely paradoxical situation. Consumer demand remained enormous, while the product itself became something of a cult object in American internet culture. People posted unboxing videos, nostalgic stories, jokes, and memes about the supposedly illegal European chocolate. Yet there was no ordinary legal way to walk into an American supermarket and simply buy the classic Kinder Surprise egg off the shelf. And naturally, whenever you combine massive consumer demand with a strict formal ban, a black market tends to emerge almost immediately.
For years, online sellers such as eBay and Etsy openly offered smuggled Kinder Surprise eggs at prices several times higher than their actual European retail value, until the platforms themselves, under pressure from U.S. regulators, began systematically blocking and removing such listings. There were also perfectly legal but somewhat borderline workarounds. Specialty candy stores near the Canadian border became destinations for American tourists who would deliberately drive across the border and back simply to stock up on chocolate that back home was technically treated almost like contraband. And for many Americans who grew up hearing stories about the ban, Kinder Surprise became something of a symbol, a tiny piece of forbidden fruit that for the rest of the world was nothing more than an ordinary childhood treat. And against this backdrop, with the product becoming increasingly iconic while remaining firmly prohibited by American law, Ferrero faced a genuinely serious challenge. The goal was no longer to find a clever way around the law, but to beat the law on its own terms.
Ferrero understood perfectly well the scale of the opportunity it had been missing for all those decades. The United States was the world's largest confectionery market by sales, yet one of the company's most recognizable and beloved products everywhere else in the world had been effectively barred from that market for nearly 80 years. A simple rebranding or packaging change would not be enough. Ferrero had only two realistic options: either convince lawmakers to change the 1938 federal child safety law, or physically redesign the product so that its construction no longer fell under the law, even under the strictest possible interpretation. The first option was practically impossible from the start. Trying to amend a federal child safety law that had been in place for almost a century and that was designed to protect children across the entire country, purely for the commercial benefit of a foreign confectionery company, was politically and legally unrealistic, no matter how many lawyers Ferrero could put on the case.
That left the second path, far more complicated from an engineering standpoint, but actually achievable. And that was the route Ferrero's engineers and lawyers spent years pursuing. The key legal detail behind the ban was extremely specific. A non-edible object could not physically be contained inside the packaging of an edible product at the moment of purchase, regardless of how effectively that object was isolated.
That meant the real engineering challenge was to separate the toy and the chocolate in such a way that they were not merely packaged separately inside the same container, but that the product itself could legally be understood as two distinct compartments, rather than one food product containing a foreign object. The solution Ferrero eventually introduced to the American market in 2017 was called Kinder Joy. It was no longer a single chocolate egg with a toy sealed inside the shell, like the original European product. Instead, it came in an egg-shaped plastic container divided into two completely separate halves by a rigid partition installed during manufacturing. One half contained a sweet chocolate and milk cream with two types of crispy chocolate balls and a small plastic spoon for eating. The other contained a toy, separately enclosed in its own small package and physically isolated from the edible portion by the sealed partition. The separation was built into the product on the production line itself, long before the Kinder Joy ever reached a truck, a warehouse, or a store shelf. Formally, under the letter of the law, this was now a fundamentally different product from the original Kinder Surprise. And that distinction was exactly what allowed U.S. regulators to approve it after years of review and negotiations. In 2017, and more broadly during 2017 through 2018, Kinder Joy officially and legally began appearing in American store shelves, including major retail chains such as Walmart, Target, and dozens of regional supermarkets. For the first time since that 1938 law had been enacted, American children could legally walk into an ordinary store and buy a Ferrero chocolate product containing a toy without violating a single provision of federal law. There is, however, one important detail for the full picture. The original Kinder Surprise egg, in its classic European form, a solid chocolate shell with a capsule inside, is still officially prohibited in the United States today. The 1938 law itself never disappeared, and it continues to apply to travelers who attempt to bring the original version of the product into the country, rather than the Americanized alternative. So this story doesn't really have a Hollywood-style happy ending in which the ban was completely overturned. Instead, Ferrero found a much more ingenious solution. It redesigned the product itself to fit within the exact wording of American law. The ban wasn't defeated, the product was. And now we return to the man who stood behind all of this from the very beginning, Michele Ferrero. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. From the history of a product and its legal battle with American legislation, to the story of a man who was far stranger and more private than you might expect from one of the richest people on the planet. Michele Ferrero led the family company for more than half a century, transforming a small provincial confectionery business in post-war Italy into a genuine global giant of the food industry. Under the family's control eventually came not only Kinder and Nutella, but also Ferrero Rocher, Tic Tac, and dozens of other internationally recognized brands, with combined annual sales reaching tens of billions of euros. By the time of his death in 2015, Michele Ferrero's personal fortune was estimated by Forbes at more than $20 billion, making him Italy's richest person for many years and placing him among the wealthiest people in Europe, alongside the owners of far more publicly visible technology and financial empires. And it is precisely this contrast that reveals one of the most fascinating details of the story. Throughout his nearly 90-year life, Michele Ferrero gave almost no full-length interviews to the press, deliberately avoided television cameras, and rarely appeared at public events, business forums, or social gatherings where billionaires of his stature would normally be expected to appear. There are remarkably few high-quality photographs of him publicly available. Most were taken from a distance, without his consent, or on rare exceptional occasions. According to people familiar with the Ferrero family, the reason for this almost obsessive secrecy was partly rooted in a very ordinary human fear: protecting his family. In Italy during the 1970s and 1980s, kidnappings of children and relatives of wealthy businessmen for ransom were a very real criminal threat. The Ferrero family therefore deliberately chose a strategy of maximum public invisibility, not as a matter of eccentricity or personal branding, but as a practical means of protecting themselves and their loved ones.
The result is an almost paradoxical, but in its own way beautiful picture. The man whose invention, a small chocolate egg with a toy inside, became recognizable to virtually every child on the planet, from Rome to Tokyo, remained almost completely unknown himself throughout his entire life. Billions of people could recognize the product, open the chocolate, and play with the little toy inside, yet very few of them ever knew the name of the man who had created the idea in the first place.